So I have a question. Have you thought about your conscience lately? No? Yes? No? Like, have you thought about, like, oh, this conscience thing? I have a thing called a conscience. And not just in the way that we might do so in kind of a light way, like Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio, right? The little bouncy conscience on the shoulder. The right of conscience has been part of I know my Unitarian Universalist vocabulary for as long as I can remember. And I will admit that I have not given it much thought recently. I've not been intentional about what is the state of my conscience? How do I understand kind of judgment and contemplation and so on? Because, and maybe frankly, because conscience is just so much exercised in these days because of trying to make sense of the world. We're kind of in the practical sense, in the execution sense of just simply making moral choices or trying to interpret the meaning of what is going on around us, we are a bit on overdrive. The moral injury of the day is an everyday process, which to me says it's all the more reason to pause and meet it and think more intentionally about conscience for a minute. Because I think it's one of those pieces as I was pondering, to me, it's part of the kind of the water in which we swim. It's this word that comes from assumptions, shared understanding. It's in our common language, both as in Unitarian Universalism, because we advocate for the right of conscience all the time, and also in our world. And the use of it, the use of conscience, the deployment of it is kind of both conscious and subconscious all at once. Kind of know where the state of our conscience is by when we, how we react to something, how quickly we react to something, and how we react. I appreciate Reverend Michael Schuler's acknowledgement that how flawed we are and how our responses to things kind of indicate a little bit the state of our conscience. And I also, in this moment, happen to like Wikipedia for their description of conscience. Conscience is a cognitive process that elicits emotion and rational associations based on an individual's moral philosophy or value system. So, conscience, according to Wikipedia, is a cognitive process that elicits emotion and rational associations based on an individual's moral philosophy or value system. And they also make the distinction that this is not about the, the, s- the systemic response we have in our central nervous system, that kind of reflex reaction. That's not this. Conscience is a little bit different. They go on. In common terms, conscience is described as leading to feelings of remorse when a person commits an act that conflicts with their moral values. The extent to which conscience informs moral judgment before an action and whether such moral judgments should or are be based on reason has occasioned debate through much of modern history. We've been talking about this for a long time with theories of basics and ethics in human life, in contrast to theories of romanticism. Got some interesting here, and reactive movements of the Middle Ages. So a lot of this is kind of Western conversation here. So conscience informs moral judgment before an action, and to varying degrees, reason is involved. I kind of appreciate the acknowledgement that reason is part of it, but not all of it, because there's also intuition and ethics and relationships and values, along with mortality and interdependence. How our conscience shows up is all wrapped up in everything that we are. In religious terms, for some traditions, conscience is connected to God or the divine or a higher power. We are called to live into the hope and expectations that for some of us that God calls us to, or are simply far larger than us, that are truly transcendent in their value, ineffable in their description. So conscience can be measured by how much we are fulfilling our divine call, if that is where your language goes. I so appreciate in the Wikipedia article, it drew from a number of different religious traditions or faith traditions, philosophy traditions. In each one, they were talking about having an understanding of conscience. One of the ones that's most important is that how conscience is about navigating good and evil. How do you make decisions that are for the good or might be harmful? Uh, how do we choose to act in this life is the basics of it. And its impact on our soul, its impact on our spirit, the results of these actions, and how we feel about ourselves afterward. And for some traditions, the the religious traditions, the question of conscience also will feed into judgment after death. This is no surprise. This is part of where our kind of religious language is too. Um, my colleague, the Reverend John Cullinan, reminds me that uh, there was a moment starting in Western culture that kind of separated conscience from religion. Um, in that age of enlightenment in the 1700s was a radical movement in human ethics and values and science. So you had intuition and reason was separated from religion. It didn't have to be connected. It didn't need to be connected with the church to have a sense of conscience. And in the founding of this country, the leaders that were involved were very much a part of this age of enlightenment thinking, and they would have had this additional source, this understanding. They would have known about this additional understanding of conscience, and that it may not necessarily have to be intertwined with religion, um, which partially, I think, fed into this whole freedom from religion idea that we're founded with, and we are fighting to preserve today. Given the Christian context of our society, whether or not you actively connect your individual or collective understanding of conscience with religion, given the Christian context of our society, I think it's probably difficult to dismiss completely any religious influence on conscience. But but it is true that many people really don't take religion into account when they decide on how to act and how to feel. This is an individual project. It is a collective project. It helps us to know how to respond, how to perceive, how to comprehend. And these are kind of grand and broad ideas, but they also come into, most of the time, they're going to come into our particular personal lives, our day to day. What happens when we wake up and we're deciding to make coffee and go about our lives? As Reverend Michael Schuler brings out, it brings out the mundane. Our exercise of conscience is really in the moment to moment. It's not in the grand gesture. Our own failings and our own falterings and our wishes to ignore that maybe we're not as good as we think we want to be. It's not good and evil and cosmic greatness, but it is in the everyday wrestling that we get to test and prove conscience again and again. As he says, as we take inventory and remember the mistakes we have made, impure thoughts we have had, schemes to hatch, we know that all is not right within. We are born to inconsistency, not purity. So, this question of conscience is this constant navigating of how we live with ourselves, if for no other purpose. I was thinking about how to kind of sort out this kind of the understanding of conscience, and I would invite you. I'm a big fan of using the order of service as for doodling. Think of conscience as a living worksheet, if you will. Think of conscience as a living worksheet and put on the page, maybe even highlight because some pretty good words in those order of service too. What are things that are most important? So let me ask the congregation, what would you include that would inform your conscience? What are the things that you would include that informs how you conduct your life, how you dream, and how what you aspire to? What are things that you would include in your conscience? What do you think? Yes. How do you make somebody else feel? So consideration for others. Yeah. Yes, Mary. Empathy. Okay. What else? Yes, Terry. Is it true and is it helpful? Boy, if people just paused for a minute and did that, wouldn't our world be just transformed? Is it true and is it helpful? Thank you. Justice? Yes. Kindness. Love. Mhm. Yes. How do you sleep at night? Right. Right. What'd you do today that you might actually get a better night's sleep tonight? Yes. Yeah. Can you get up in your skin tomorrow? Yep, that's true. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I think think those can include love, it can include what are our major values, it can include the care of the earth. If you think about the mission of the congregation, all of those things are part of it. And then I think the use of conscience is kind of an ever running flow chart, if you will. If this, then that. Yes, no, and so on. What matters most and what do you do about it? The holy, the family, the environment, the sacred, and more. But then there's also moments, and I think we really need to be kind of exercising and kind of checking in on the state of our conscience on a regular basis because then we might be asked to do something big. You know, the story of Viola Liuzzo is one that keeps being shared, and it's one that's nationally recognized. It's been appreciated very much in Alabama and the civil rights movement as a whole. So Viola was a wife and a mother. She was a white woman who had her own hardships. She was managing a family, and she was witnessing the worst hardships of her neighbors, of her black neighbors. And she was so moved that she got in her car and drove from Detroit to Selma. Viola did what she could with her resources, helped people move to and from where they needed to be, all for the sake of human rights, all for the sake of civil rights. In 2002, I joined other Unitarian Universalist ministers for a trip to Montgomery and to Selma. And part of what we did was drive the route taken by the civil rights activists to drive the route taken for the march. We too walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, the site of so many conflicts, and we visited what is now the Civil Rights Museum in Selma. And we stopped at the memorial stone for Viola on Route 80. It is on the side of the road along a stretch that is rural, agricultural, and far from much of anything. There's not a lot between Selma and Montgomery. There was even less then. The memorial, it's a beautiful stone. You can stop, you can kind of walk to it, and so on. It's well done. And it's at kind of a high point, a rise in the surrounding land. The the actual location of where she was stopped and shot, um, is on a low point of floodplain. It's like a couple of tenths of a mile down the road. It's on a floodplain, it's crowded with trees, there's no, land really accessible from outside of the road itself. You're just in a dark road. And it would have been very dark and very isolated that night, and it still is. Still is. We talk about Viola in part because she wasn't remarkable. She was like any of us. She was a wife and a mom. She was human. She had her quirks and her flaws. She was just one of us. She wanted to do the right thing for the sake of others and put her whole self into it. Her life wasn't easy, but she was willing. And so appreciate her motivation and her choice to simply pay attention and try to do the best because of what was mattering most. We're talking about conscience. It's not just a nice conversation and unpacking a little bit of Wikipedia. It's something where we are needing to be moving into the world with strength. How can we be stronger? Because we know what we dream of and how much we screw up along the way, how we are fully human in our aspirations. I have a piece from the Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd. So I invite you to turn on your universal translators for religious language at this moment. She speaks of God. So for you, it might be higher power, it might be the universe, it might be the holy, it might be another presence for you. Reverend Nancy says, if God's name is love, that God compels us to resist the fall to sinful violence by pushing back with muscular resolve against the social structures that confine our capacity to care. The universalist God for a tragic era is not a gauzy, hymn singing force of personal devotion that draws us endlessly toward itself, but a fierce and compelling power that grips us by the collar amid our rebellious descent and calls us to choose the will to mutuality all over again, even when that choice is so risky it could utterly remake us. It is a fierce and compelling power that grips us by the collar amid our rebellious descent and calls us to choose the will to mutuality all over again, even when that choice is risky. It's so risky it could completely remake us. I was with a study group of ministers this week as we wondered together how to resist authoritarianism in our time. And we talked about violence and martyrdom. So I bring out Viola's story, not to praise her death, not to glorify her mortal sacrifice. I mean, she had kids. There was real impact on what happened to her. I bring this out to sorrow at the circumstance, to refresh a commitment to say, what can we do so this doesn't happen again? It's not the glory of death, but it is to aspire to do better, to call us on to further action, to be called, as Reverend Nancy says, forward into mutuality again and again, even when it is hard, even when it risks everything. A number of my colleagues have been on the front lines of immigration and detention conflict in Chicago. Given that this recently came up on Friday, I think I need to talk about it a little bit. You might have seen the news from Friday when a crowd of largely religious leaders were physically pushed and assaulted by local and state police. The protesters were operating from peacefulness and nonviolence. They were asking to meet with the detainees to offer spiritual support, which was the least they could do given the reports of the terrible physical conditions in the detention center. They were singing, they had locked arms, and a number of them decided to simply walk forward towards the detention center. Law enforcement forced them back, there was a whole lot of big pushing, a whole lot of big struggle. Um, Law enforcement pulled some individuals from the protesters and forced them to the ground violently and detained them. Again, peaceful, empty handed protesters. Some were arrested, and that included several of the colleagues that I was with this week. Now, the mass of protesters was a lot in that one area. They had kind of limited the gathering to, and they were singing and chanting and negotiating. They were not violent. And there's a number of videos circulating in the news and other sources if you are up to watching. These religious leaders were doing what they could on behalf of the people suffering from a lack of food, water, sanitation, medication, and access to their families and legal advice. Every participant at that protest made a choice about how close to be on those front lines, and these protests and witnessing will continue. As Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd brings out, the moment needs something strong to push back with a muscular resolve. We may not be near Chicago, but we have challenges, we have moments in front of us. So, how can we push back? How can we push ourselves to push back? This is the question we get to take up in part with some of the projects we will have the congregation vote on during the congregational meeting, in fact. So, the question of conscience. It is good and evil, it is right and wrong, it is internal, external, it is all the flow of the back and forth of how we can keep showing up, even as often as we back up and don't want to be involved. We will not be who we once were before this chapter of politics and social shift and racial reckoning, before we were becoming more aware of the impact um, and need for visibility for folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, interfaith, intersex, asexual, and questioning. We will not be the same after this chapter and its impact on the environment and our basic humanity. So let our conscience, let ourselves be changed. We need to let ourselves be changed, be impacted, be remade, and to do so in a community that comes from love, that so loves the world as we do, that we can, in fact, get over ourselves and be called to transform it in ourselves and become more whole. How shall we meet this challenge? Let us go forth. Amen.